For most of his career, Chris Rock was positioned as the guy who tells the truth nobody else will. He wasn't the loudest comic, or the most chaotic, or the most outrageous. He was the commentator, the observer, the man who dissected black culture, white culture, relationships, money, fame, and power with precision. Early on, that made him beloved, but that same positioning, the role of cultural judge, is also what slowly turned people against him. Chris Rock's first major fracture with audiences came not from a scandal, but from how often he positioned himself above the people he was talking about. His comedy wasn't self-deprecating in the way Richard Pryor's was. It wasn't confessional, it was diagnostic. He spoke as if he had escaped something others hadn't, and the distance between commentary and contempt was often razor thin. Over time, that distance disappeared. One of the earliest and most lasting points of tension was how Rock spoke about black people, particularly poor black people, in his stand-up. His routines frequently relied on contrast between what he framed as respectable black behavior and what he openly mocked. At first, audiences laughed because the jokes were sharp and the observations felt familiar. But repetition turned familiarity into fatigue. The jokes stopped sounding like critique and started sounding like scolding. Instead of punching up or inward, Rock increasingly sounded like someone punching down while insisting it was for the audience's own good. That perception hardened as Rock's fame grew. Once he became wealthy, insulated, and deeply embedded in Hollywood, his critiques began to feel less like truth-telling and more like distance masquerading as insight. When a comedian repeatedly critiques a community they no longer live within, the tone changes. Audiences can sense when observation turns into detachment. And with Chris Rock, detachment became his default posture. Another fracture point came from his willingness to repeatedly critique black women in ways that felt less observational and more dismissive. Over the years, his jokes about relationships, marriage, dating, and gender dynamics increasingly positioned black women as obstacles, burdens, or punchlines rather than participants. While Rock often defended this as just comedy, the lack of balance mattered. Audiences noticed patterns, and the patterns suggested not complexity but resentment. As cultural conversations evolved, Chris Rock didn't evolve with them, he resisted them. Rather than adapting his approach, he doubled down on the idea that being offended was the audience's problem. This stance used to feel rebellious. Eventually, it just felt lazy. When a comedian frames every critique of their material as proof of their bravery, they stop engaging with the substance of the criticism. Rock increasingly positioned himself as a martyr for free speech. Even when the pushback wasn't censorship, it was disappointment. His handling of sensitive topics, particularly gender and identity, accelerated that shift. When Rock joked about trans women, domestic issues, and trauma without adjusting his framing, audiences didn't just hear provocation. They heard a refusal to listen. The cultural gap between him and younger audiences widened quickly. Instead of recalibrating, he leaned into nostalgia for an era when comedians weren't questioned, implicitly dismissing the idea that audiences had changed for legitimate reasons. At the same time, Chris Rock's offstage persona began to clash with his public image. Fans who encountered him in person increasingly reported interactions that felt cold, dismissive, or transactional. Rock has never cultivated warmth, but over time that cool detachment curdled into something closer to contempt. Stories circulated about rushed meet and greets, minimal engagement, and an air of annoyance at being approached at all. While no celebrity owes fans access, repeated unsatisfactory encounters reinforce an existing narrative. When people already feel talked down to in your work, they don't interpret aloofness as privacy. They interpret it as arrogance. This erosion of goodwill happened gradually, but it mattered. By the time the Oscars arrived, Chris Rock was no longer a universally loved truth-teller. He was a divisive figure who many felt had stopped punching up and started swinging indiscriminately, all while insisting that criticism proved his point. Then came the night that froze everything in place. At the 94th Academy Awards, Rock stepped on stage to present an award. In the span of seconds, he made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, referencing G.I. Jane. The joke landed unevenly, not because it was devastatingly offensive, but because it felt careless. Jada Pinkett Smith has alopecia, a medical condition that causes hair loss. Whether Rock knew or not became irrelevant in that moment. The audience reaction was mixed, and then Will Smith walked onto the stage and slapped him. What happened next wasn't just about violence, it was about context colliding. To some viewers, Rock became the victim instantly and permanently. To others, the slap didn't erase years of resentment toward his tone, his targets, or his refusal to adapt. People weren't debating whether assault was wrong. They were debating whether Chris Rock was as blameless as the simplified narrative suggested. Rock's response in the moment was composed, but his silence afterward did damage. He didn't immediately contextualize the joke, reflect on impact, or clarify intent. Instead, he waited, and when he finally addressed it in stand-up, he framed himself almost exclusively as the wronged party. While that was true in a literal sense, it ignored the broader emotional context many people were reacting to. Audiences didn't just want him to condemn violence. They wanted acknowledgement that words exist in ecosystems, not vacuums. By refusing to interrogate his own role at all, Rock reinforced the idea that he was unwilling to self-examine. His stand-up special following the incident doubled down on grievance rather than reflection. For fans already uneasy with him, this confirmed their feelings. For critics, it cemented the idea that Rock saw himself as above accountability, even conversational accountability. The Oscars slap didn't create dislike for Chris Rock. It crystallized it. It forced people to articulate feelings they'd had for years but hadn't fully named. The incident became a symbol, not a cause. A flashpoint that exposed long simmering tensions between comedian and audience, performer and subject, critique and contempt. Today, Chris Rock exists in a strange cultural space. He is respected for his legacy but resisted in the present. People acknowledge his skill but recoil from his posture. He is no longer seen as speaking truth to power. He is seen as protecting his position by refusing to adjust it. What people dislike about Chris Rock isn't that he's edgy or honest or unfiltered. It's that he increasingly feels uninterested in connection. Comedy, at its best, invites people in. Rock's comedy now often feels like it stands at a distance, pointing, diagnosing, judging, and then daring the audience to object. The unsatisfactory fan encounters, the dismissive tone, the doubling down after criticism, and the refusal to evolve all feed the same conclusion. People don't feel seen by Chris Rock anymore, they feel talked at. And in a culture that values empathy as much as insight, that distance is fatal. The Oscars slap didn't end Chris Rock's career, but it froze his image in a way he can't easily escape. Not as a martyr, not as a villain, but as a man whose refusal to look inward finally collided with a moment that forced everyone else to. And once that happens, laughter doesn't disappear, but affection does.